Hi Year 13, so the poem that we're going to go over in this video is Out of the Bag. We have looked at this one in class, so feel free to pause at points to either add to notes or to complete the notes if you weren't in on that particular lesson. I'll breeze through the first few points quite quickly because we've already covered this, but the starter was looking at some key vocabulary that comes up in the poem, so spend a minute or two just making sure that you've got these down. So you've got Epidurus, a place in Greece. It is known for its healing sanatorium. Poetica Doctus, a poet who is well schooled in classical models and ideals of Greece. Asclepius, a Greek god who represented the healing aspects of medicine. A therifer, so a person who carries a container in which incense is burnt during a ceremony, and Hygeia is a daughter of Asclepius who represents cleanliness. So as I said, either pause those and make sure that you've got those notes down, or if you missed one of those, just make sure you've got it down now. Okay, so as ever, you've got the copy of the poem there. I will read through that and then we will have a little look at some questions that I've put up. If you weren't in, obviously pause and go over those now yourself, so you've got your first initial critical perspective written down and your ideas written down first before exploring then and contributing with the notes that I'm going to provide. And then we will have a little look at it and analyse it stanza by stanza. Out of the bag. All of us came in Dr. Curlin's bag. He'd arrive with it, disappear to the room, and by the time he'd reappeared to wash those nosy, rosy, big soft hands of his in the scullery basin, its lined insides, the colour of a spaniel's inside lug, were empty for all to see, the trap-sprung mouth unsnibbed and gaping wide. Then, like a hypnotist, unwinding us, he'd wind the instruments back into their lining, tie the cloth like an apron round itself, darken the door, and leave, with the bag in his hand, a plump arc by the keel, until the next time came, and in he'd come in his fur-lined collar that was also spaniel-coloured, and go stooping up to the room again, a whiff of disinfectant, a Dutch interior gleam of waistcoat satin and highlights on the forceps, getting the water ready that was next, not plumping hot, and not lukewarm, but soft, luscious, saved for him from the rain-butt, and savoured by him afterwards, all thanks denied as he towelled hard and fast, then held his arms out suddenly behind him, to be squired and silk-lined into the camel coat, at which point he once turned his eyes upon me, Hibernian. Beyond the north wind blew 2 peepholes to the locked room I saw into every time his name was mentioned, skimmed milk and ice, swabbed porcelain, the white and chill of tiles, steel hooks, chrome surgery tools, and blood dreeps in the sawdust, where it thickened at the foot of each cold wall, and overheard the little pendant, teat-hued infant parts strung neatly from a line up near the ceiling, a toe, a foot, and shin, an arm, a cock, a bit like the rosebud in his butthole. Poetic Doctus, Peter Levy says, sanctuaries of Asclepius, called Asclepians, were the equivalent of hospitals in ancient Greece, or of shrines like Lourdes, says Poetica Doctus Graves, or of the cure by poetry that cannot be coerced, say I, who realised at Epidurus that the whole place was a sanatorium, with theatre and gymnasium and baths, a site of incubation, where incubation was technical and ritual, meaning sleep, where epiphany occurred and you met the god. Hatless, groggy, shadowing myself, as the therifer I was in an open-air procession in Lourdes in 56. When I nearly fainted from the heat and fumes, again I nearly fainted as I bent to pull a bunch of grass and hallucinated Dr. Curlin at the steamed-up glass of our scullery window, starting in to draw with his large pink index finger dot-faced men with button spots and a straight line down their fronts, and women with dot breasts, giving them all a set of droopy sausage arms and legs that soon began to run. And then, as he dipped and larded in the generous suds again, miraculum, the baby bits all came together swimming, into his soapy, big, hygienic hands, and I myself came too, blinded with sweat, blinking and shaky in the windless light. Bits of the grass I pulled I posted off, to one going into chemotherapy, and one who had come through. I didn't want to leave the place, or link up with the others. It was midday, mid-May, pre-tourist sunlight, in the precincts of the god. The very sight of the temple of Asclepius. I wanted nothing more than to lie down under hogweed, under seeded grass, and to be visited in the very eye of the day by Hygeia, his daughter, her name still clarifying the haven of light she was, the undarkening door. The light I came from and the rest of us all came from stays pure reality, where I stand alone, standing the passage of time, and she's asleep, in sheets put on for the doctor, wedding presents that showed up again and again, bridal and unusual and useful at births and deaths. Me at the bedside, incubating for real, appearing to her as she closes and opens her eyes, then lapses back into a faraway smile, whose precinct of vision I would enter every time to assist and be asked in that hoarsened whisper of triumph. And what do you think of the new wee baby the doctor brought for us all when I was asleep? Okay, so you've got a task there. So many key ideas are interlinked throughout the poem. For each event or memory listed below, consider how it develops and combines ideas of birth, illness and religion. And you've got some bullet points there obviously to follow. So again, if you weren't in for this lesson, then obviously pause and have a little go at answering that and trying to link those ideas and thoughts throughout the poem. Going back to the start of the poem then, I will start an analysis going through stanza by stanza, offering some suggestions then from what I've thought of the poem, my critical perspective, and then what I've read from others. And I'll put those sort of links at the end then for you to look through. So starting with the title as always, so we don't neglect that. It is a bit more ambiguous because we're not really sure of what bag we're talking about at the very start of the poem. It's not really until we get into the poem that we realise the significance of the bag that he's making reference to. But I mean, the fact there that it's part of the title, it does give special attention to this bag that he's describing. Going into the first stanza then, we have got the sort of parts of this poem are numbered. So we've got part 1 here, where he's sort of focusing specifically on one aspect, and that is when we go to read it, we're talking about the doctor, he's talking about a memory from his childhood. So all of us came in Dr. Curlin's bag, so we've got here as well this sort of collective. He's referring to a group, and we come to realise he's talking about his brothers and sisters and his family. All of us came, but actually the fact that we've got that collective might also suggest that he's talking more collectively about everyone. So all of us came in Dr. Curlin's bag. So maybe this idea that we've all come from a doctor's bag. The fact that he includes the title of the doctor there, it shows the importance of him, and also it's not abbreviated. It's not just DR Doctor, but he writes it in full. You know, it lends importance to the significance of the doctor, and we can see when we read through the rest of the poem the significance, the importance of social class, and we see a difference between the social class of the doctor and Seamus Heaney's family, because they're of a different social class, and there's a bit of a contrast to the doctor and Seamus's family. So all of us came in Dr. Curlin's bag, and we've got that as a declarative statement at the beginning there, that opening sentence that's contained within one line. So it's very much factual. So in his mind as a young child, this was what he believed in implicitly. He'd arrive with it, disappear to the room, and by the time he'd reappear to wash. So we've got here some verbs, these very active verbs, providing, it's almost suggesting there's this sense of him being like a magician. He'd arrive, he'd disappear, then reappear. So these very active verbs, it gives it almost an air of mystique to this doctor, that there's something magical in what he does. The fact that he almost goes in with this bag and then by the end of it produces a child as his mother's giving birth. But obviously in Heaney's young mind, the way he's made logic and sense of what's happening is he believes that the brothers and sisters that are being born are actually assembled out of the doctor's bag, which we come to realise a little bit later in the poem, so I'll get to that and explain that. Those nosy, rosy, big hands of his. So he draws particular attention by the use of these adjectives, this listing. So we've got this asyndetic listing and of adjectives, and it sort of draws attention then to his hands, and maybe because they are so important in his profession as a doctor, because he uses them to examine, to perform sort of surgeries, to deliver the baby. So it's that significance. But you could say as well it's highlighting this very stereotypically patriarchal idea of men working with their hands. So even though he has got that higher status of a doctor, and we see being a doctor as being in the medical profession as maybe more of a professional career path, it's still something where he's working with his hands, so therefore still fits with this patriarchal expectation of men working with their hands. But also the fact that he does describe them as nosy hands as well, it sort of maybe suggests that the doctor, while he does have this higher status, is maybe well known by Heaney, and probably would be by, I imagine, the whole village. They'd know their local doctor. But it suggests that idea of then, the doctor, the family doctor, has examined him maybe in the past, so he's well aware of his hands. In the scullery basin, so colloquial language here again, so we've got this idea of a little utility room that the doctor's using where he's washing his hands. It's lined inside, so this idea as well of is making reference to the bag. The bag is lined on the inside, that sort of adjective lined, showing that it's maybe quite a rich material, that it's quite an expensive bag. So again, showing that sort of divide, that wealth of the doctor. The colour of a spaniel's inside lug. So it's interesting that we've got this parenthesis, so we've got the brackets to add in this additional information, giving it again this quite sort of there's almost a zoomorphic idea linked to the bag, where it's kind of comparing it to the inside of a spaniel's ear, and that colloquial language of inside lug, but actually it's maybe describing that rich colour, and again suggesting that there's maybe something fascinating about this bag, almost as though the bag itself is alive, and it's the bag that's delivering these children and producing these children. Were empty for all to see, the trap-sprung mouth unsnibbed and gaping wide. So almost in Heaney's mind as this young child, it makes sense that the babies, his brothers and sisters that are born, come from the bag, because he arrives with this bag, but then when he's washing his hands and the bag is open beside him, Heaney can see that there's nothing in the bag, so maybe that's where the babies come from. So in his mind it kind of reinforces as a child this sort of childish belief, this innocence then that he has surrounding childbirth. Then, like a hypnotist, so again this simile providing this mystical quality, this idea of something being quite almost supernatural about the doctor, that or godlike even in his abilities of what he's able to do, unwinding us. So this idea as well of the sense of producing the brothers and sisters, and him being part of that collective pronoun again, showing that he believes that that's where babies come from, and a sense of I got here of ravelling and unpacking, like that idea of creation, so creating life itself. He'd wind the instruments back into the lining, tie the cloth like an apron round itself. Interesting use of that simile there, like an apron, because aprons stereotypically we associate with the idea of in the kitchen, and again, like I said, very stereotypically with being something that women would wear in the kitchen to make food. But again, the idea of creation and creating something. But it's interesting that in this poem, Heaney doesn't it's the doctor's ability to create life. He doesn't really draw attention to the fact that women are the ones that create life and give birth, and his mother at the end very much sort of reinforces that idea when she asks the question about, do you like the child that the doctors brought for us while I was sleeping? She kind of diminishes her role in that. That she's not necessarily the one that's pushed this child out of her body. She gives that kind of over to the doctor. So it's an interesting idea here about what the woman does and what the man does in this situation. But you could talk about it in terms of social class as well. So it doesn't necessarily have to completely be this idea of the roles of men and women. We can link it to society as well and social status. Darken the door and leave. So there's almost, again, like I said, I've already mentioned this, but there's almost a godlike sense to this doctor who darkens their door and then enters, produces a baby, and then darkens the door by leaving again. And that's interesting, so I'll make a link here when he talks about later on this idea of an undarkened door. With the bag in his hand, so that repetition of the bag draws attention to it repeatedly, so obviously it's a very significant part of the doctor's kit. A plump arc by the keel. Interesting, because when we're talking about an arc, we're talking about maybe that link, the biblical idea of ark being a ship, and the idea then with an arc by the keel. The arc of a boat is down near the keel, and it's what provides the boat with stability and allows it to sort of stay stable on the water. So maybe that idea of the life-giving work that the doctor does, he provides that stability. So it's just an interesting link there, and also quite jarring with the rest of what he's just been talking about. Until the next time came, and he'd come in his fur-lined collar that was also spaniel-coloured. So we've got that idea of, adverbial of time there, next time. And this idea then that, there's frequent visits, so, it does kind of link in, I suppose, contextually with the idea of Seamus Heaney being Irish, and the idea as well, because this is sort of further back in time, we are talking about, having maybe a bigger family and having more children in the family. So there's a contextual link there. In his fur-lined collar that was also spaniel-coloured, so again, this higher class, this idea that he can afford this fur-lined collared coat. It was also spaniel-coloured, so this idea as well of the rich coloured coat. Getting the water ready, that was next. Not plumping hot and not lukewarm but soft. So we've got these sort of verbs, it's almost ritual-like in the way that this is being described. So getting, saved, there is like a routine, a ritual to it for this godlike man who comes in to provide children and give children to the family. Not plumping hot and not lukewarm, so it's very specific there as well, that idea of ensuring that it's perfect. But soft, sud luscious. Again, there's almost a richness here that, it's especially for him, and adds that ritual-like idea then of creating the water for him, saved him from the water butt. And savoured by him afterwards. So, this idea as well then of him sort of appreciating that. But it's interesting that all thanks denied, so that verb denied, it's almost that superior attitude that he has then. He doesn't give thanks for what's been given, and does that link in then with his status and the fact that he expects them to behave and do this for him because he is superior in that sense. Denied as he towelled hard and fast. So there's an antithesis there, because earlier we were talking about the hands being quite soft and rosy, and yet the way he's sort of washing them then is in antithesis to that, juxtaposes with it, that sort of idea then of hard and fast. Then he held his arms out suddenly behind him, so alliteration there drawing attention to the way he's behaving, but that adverb suddenly in particular expresses this idea that he expects them to be ready for him. And that links in really well with the next stanza, because it describes him as being squired. So to be squired and silk-lined. So that verb sort of squired, they wait on him. So again, sort of emphasising his importance, because a squire would be a young boy usually that would sort of look after a lord and sort of see to their needs, and that's what he expects. So again, emphasising his high status. At which point he once turned his eyes upon me. There's very much a kind of dehumanisation here in the way he's described. He turned his eyes on me. That verb almost quite cold and quite godlike. He turned his eyes on me, and the fact that it just focuses solely on his eyes, not that he turned towards me, but he turned his eyes on me. It dehumanises this doctor, makes him seem more sort of godlike. Hyperborean, so this race of ancient Greeks who lived in a perfect world. So again, giving him this sort of other than human feeling, that he's more godlike, that he's something that's superior. Beyond the north wind blew, two peoples in a locked room I saw into. So he's making reference to this kind of, he was fascinated with what was going on behind those closed doors when his mother was giving birth. Milk and ice, swabbed porcelain, the white and chill of tiles, steels, books, chrome. So this becomes almost quite chaotic, this jumble of ideas: milk, ice, the porcelain, the white, chill, steel, chrome. There's sort of maybe a jumbled in his mind the events that have taken place and his memories of his siblings being born as well. But there's a sort of lexical set here of medical instruments then as well, which would have been, I suppose, unusual in the home. You wouldn't have had that usually. And blood droops in the sawdust where it thickened at the foot of each cold wall. So what used to happen years ago is that you would have any sort of minor operations would take place at home. You'd have, and the host that would be, you'd prepare for that. Sawdust would be put down to sort of absorb any blood, and that's what he's making reference to there. In fact, if you've ever read Roald Dahl's Boy, you will have read how he gets part of his tonsils cut out, and he has that done at home, or no, sorry, it's his sister gets her appendix removed, and that's done in their house, in their playroom. So that would not be unusual for a sort of minor operation to take place at home, and families would be prepared for that. So that idea of sawdust on the floor would not seem unusual there to sort of absorb any blood. And overhead, the little pendant, teat-hued infant parts strung neatly from a line up near the ceiling. So this is where almost like Heaney's imagination has run away with him, where he imagines there's almost like a Frankenstein-esque gothic horror version of this sort of scene and image here in the poem, where he imagines these little parts of a baby being strung up so that the doctor can assemble them together. Like I said, like a sort of Frankenstein-esque doctor, strung neatly from a line up near the ceiling: a toe, a foot, and shin, an arm, cock. So listing all these sort of little bits and little parts that the doctor will gradually assemble. But that listing almost seems quite grotesque, really. This idea is it's quite funny, but again quite grotesque. A little bit like the rosebud in his butthole. So again, this very almost humorous and childlike, innocent description of what he imagines is going on in this room. But it's quite endearing as well. It's quite funny. On to the second part of the poem then. So we start with the phrase poeta doctus. So already we've got a shift here in terms of social class, because it's kind of revealing for us that Heaney himself then has almost changed or sort of gone further with his social class, and almost become has stepped out of his social class and gone further. So Peter Levy says, and that's a poet, so poet, academic, archaeologist and former priest, professor at poetry at Oxford as well, so some contextual links there in terms of who he's mentioning. sanctuaries of Asclepius, so called Asclepians. So actually Asclepius, if in medicine you've seen the staff with the snake around it, that's who that represents. It's Asclepius, this god of healing, where we're the equivalent, sorry, of hospitals. So we've got this link, this idea here as well, between kind of poetry and this idea of being almost a cure for certain things, and then a link between the sort of physical cures there as well. There's very much a link between the idea of poetry and literature being healing, with the doctor being physically healing then, and concentrating on physical healing. In ancient Greece, or of shrines like Lourdes, so we've got here a religious link to Heaney, and I said him being contextually the links there with his heritage and being Irish, and links to religion. Lourdes is a Catholic shrine for the Virgin Mary, based in the south of France, and he's mentioning here an experience of his own, so we've got almost this personal anecdote being included of his experience then of going to a site that is known in Lourdes. This place is known to have healing properties, so a lot of people go there in the hopes of being cured. Says Poeta Doctus Graves, or of the cure by poetry that cannot be coerced, say I, who realised at Epidurus. So, like I said, it's making those sort of strong links between the idea of poetry and literature being quite healing for the mind, of the soul, and the link then between the physical alignment of the body as well then with the psyche almost. That the whole place was a sanatorium with a theatre and gymnasium and baths, so that idea of sort of different aspects all coming together, that idea of balance between the body and the mind, that was evident in sort of early medicine really, in Greek medicine, and their understanding of the body and how the body works and how illnesses then affect the body, because there was this idea, this belief in ancient Greece that if your body was out of balance, your humours, they referred to them as, and you have 4 humours according to Greek medicine, if they were out of balance, that would then cause illness. So they tried to kind of treat all aspects then to bring you back into balance. A site of incubation, so we've got that link to the first part of the poem, this idea of birth. So incubation, where incubation was technical and ritual, and again we've got those a sort of ritual link, meaning sleep, where epiphany occurred and you met the gods. So we've got this kind of link, and with sort of the idea of epiphany as well. It's the Greek word meaning to reveal. So that idea of sort of sitting in that sort of warm room in almost a sauna environment, and becoming so drowsy, and sort of having that epiphany, that hallucination of seeing and meeting God to cure you. Hatless, groggy, shadowing myself. So quite an ominous verb there, quite kind of darkens the tone a little bit, the atmosphere here. But we've got this link, this idea as the thurifer, so somebody who carries incense in the procession as he goes through Lourdes. We've got this link of when he was in that procession that he nearly passed out. And he's making the link here as well. When I nearly fainted from the heat and fumes, again I nearly fainted as I bent. So maybe there's a suggestion here of Heaney himself being maybe quite old, quite frail at this point, and not being kind of that young innocent boy who thought that the doctor brought the parts of his brothers and sisters to assemble when his mother was giving birth. So he has this hallucination, and he does actually, when we find out later here, when he sort of blinks and comes to, that he does actually pass out because he has this hallucination. So Dr. Curlin at the steamed up glass of the scullery window, so it sort of links back to the first part of the poem where he's thinking about the doctor in the scullery, starting in to draw with his large pink index finger. So again, this sort of link and idea of his hands creating something, and his hands being the tools and instruments that he uses to work with. And again, that's like this idea as well of the Doctor creating life. Finger dot faced men with button spots in starlight line down their forms, and women with dot breasts, giving them all a set of droopy sausage arms and legs. And again, we've got almost this grotesque imagery, this idea of creation, like I said, this godlike power to create that the Doctor has in his hallucination, as well as in his sort of past memories of his brothers and sisters being created, in his mind being created. That soon began to run, so like I said, breathing almost life into these figures then that he's kind of drawing on the steamed up window, the Doctor is in his hallucination, of the figures. And then he dipped and laved in the generous suds again, so this idea as well of going back in and washing his hands. The baby bits all come together swimming, so again the hallucination almost becomes quite blurred here, because water there is almost used symbolically to the idea of giving life. Miraculum. So we've got Latin there as well, this idea of miracle, because that's what that word means. But you've got the sense again coming back to what I was saying about Heaney then changing social classes, because he's clearly educated to be using and making reference to so many things here that sort of imply his education, that show and highlight his education. The baby bits all came together swimming into his soapy big hygienic hands. So again, this fascination and link onto his hands, soapy big hygienic, and hygienic linking almost to where he is as well, with what he goes on to say about Asclepius's daughter Hygeia, but I'll come to that when I get to that line. And I myself came to blinded with sweat. So again, this idea of he has passed out, and could it suggest that he's quite frail, quite old at this point? But he's blinded with sweat, blinking and shaky. These verbs maybe suggest a weakness, maybe then drawing antithesis or juxtaposition to the idea of him being quite childlike and baby-like. And you could say it draws attention maybe to the secular nature of life, that, you know, we're born quite weak and frail and we need to be protected and looked after and cared for, and then almost when we become older there is that link back to becoming maybe weaker physically, needing maybe more support and help with things. So there's almost like a cycle idea there of life. Blinking and shaking in the windless light. So on to the third part then, the last part, which links very closely to the part just before it. Bits of grass I pulled, I posted off to one going into chemotherapy. So we've got then this idea of a supernatural belief almost in he collects some grass at this at these ruins, the sanatorium at Epidaurus, and he posts them back to people who are getting, you know, modern chemotherapy treatment here. There's an antithesis to the ritual of Greek mythology and the Greek medicine to this modern technology and this modern cure for, well, not cure but treatment rather, it's a better word for it, for cancer, and one who had come through it. So again, there's almost that link, that idea that, you know, he's older and he's got friends who are going through illnesses and diseases that we stereotypically tend to get as we get older. I didn't want to leave the place or link up with the others. So it's interesting there that he would prefer to be at this area where there is maybe a sense of, like I said, the ritual and Greek mythology. Maybe link back to that idea of the poeta doctus, the doctor of poetry, and that idea of maybe medicine being more holistic and looking more at the body and the mind in balance with each other. It was midday, mid-May, pre-tourist sunlight. So we've got that link there to it being quite hot, and part of the reason why he's passed out maybe. And he's sort of the middle of the way through there, the day and May, and the post-tourist sunlight, so being there when other people aren't around. In the precincts of the god, so precinct suggesting sort of area of the gods, But again, it links into the idea of mythology and comes away from our kind of more clinical idea about sort of antithesis with this part here of modern medicine. The very sight of the temple of Asclepius, I wanted nothing more than to lie down under hogweed, under seeded grass. So, as I said, he's at these ruins here in Epidurus, where Asclepius was said to be his temple then, where they worshipped Asclepius for his power of healing. Under hogweed, under seeded grass, and to be visited in the very eye of the day by Hygeia. So, this urge to almost return back to this method of medicine and healing that he sort of mentions here with this incubation and ritual. And he goes on to mention Hygeia, so she's the Greek goddess of health and is the daughter of Asclepius. So his daughter, her name still clarifying the haven of light she was, so it's sort of drawing attention to the meaning of her name here, which obviously has roots in the word hygienic that we use now. The haven of light that she was, the undarkening door. So interesting use there. I mentioned this idea of the doctor darkening the door as he comes to assemble the baby parts when Heaney's mother gives birth, and then darkening the door as he leaves. But it's interesting that he describes the undarkening door, so reveals that actually she will never make that visit to him. So although he desperately wants to kind of lay down under the hogweed and under the seeded grass and have this vision, this epiphany of this God visiting him, he knows that she'll never visit him because she doesn't exist. So it's that acceptance of belief, maybe not necessarily being rooted in reality. Our final part then of the poem is far more sort of cyclical. Here it comes back to some of the ideas that we saw at the beginning, because now he returns to the room I came from. So interesting that we've got this switch, the room. So this sort of noun is antithesized with the opening of the poem, because he says that out of the bag, that he came out of a bag, but now as he's older he's reflecting that it's from a room that he came from, not the bag. It's interesting that he still hasn't mentioned that he came from his mother, so interesting that he doesn't mention the woman's kind of part in producing children. And the rest of us all came from. So again, this idea that he's using that collective pronoun to talk about his family, but it's interesting that there's that antithesis at the beginning. He's no longer talking about the bag that he's come from. He realises now as an adult that it's not the bag that they actually came from. Stays pure reality where I stand alone. So that room isn't as he maybe remembers it in his memory. It stays in his memory though, in the way that he created it in his mind. Standing the passage of time, and she's asleep. So he's mentioning he's coming back to his mother here, and she's asleep in sheets put on for the doctor. So again, interesting, it's this status that comes back to it. Wedding presents that showed up again and again, bridal and unusual and useful at births and deaths. So he's referring to kind of their best bed sheets, the mother's, sort of best, she wants to present the best aspects there because this doctor, who's of a higher social status, is visiting the house. So, they want to kind of put their best sheets on the bed when they are giving birth, or if somebody dies, they make sure that the house looks appropriate for this person of a higher status visiting them. Me at the bedside, incubating for real. Now, it's unclear in these lines whether he is talking about himself when he was a baby, and obviously he would have at some point been in that room after his mother gave birth to him beside her, and then her sort of laying there and kind of dozing after just giving birth. And that's the only, we have an implication here of the effort and strength that she's gone through to produce the child, but it's never explicitly said that she's the one that's created the child and pushed the child out. Me at the bedside, incubating for real, appearing to her as she closes and opens her eyes and then lapses back into a faraway smile. So there it almost sounds as though he's talking about himself being a baby and when he was first sort of born, and being in that room and imagining his mother laying there on the bed exhausted, looking at him in and out of, as I said, sort of resting, and kind of obviously the faraway smile there, the faraway emphasising the effort that she's just gone through to deliver a baby, but smile showing how content and happy she is. But then this sort of, it changes here because he's saying, I would enter every time to assist and be asked, in that hoarsened whisper of triumph. So, you know, you've got this little concerned child then that goes to see his mother, and her speaking to him after the birth of his siblings. So it switches from this verse here where we get the sense of she must be talking about him being a baby and incubating after just being born, to his siblings being born and him going in to view them. And a faraway smile, whose prescient of vision. So again, we've got that kind of link back there, because prescient suggesting, you know, area bordered by walls and buildings. It's interesting that the bedroom there where she's given birth is seen as maybe her prescient there as well within her vision. I would enter every time. So, you know, emphasis there as well maybe on how often that occurred, every time. To assist and be asked in that hoarsened whisper. So again, hoarsened suggesting how much effort she's gone through here and how much energy she's expended by giving birth. And we start almost with in the middle of a conversation here, because she uses this conjunction. And what do you think of the new wee baby? And these adjectives here, particularly wee being quite colloquial, again emphasising the difference between the doctor, who again is so godlike he doesn't even speak, but the mother then, her colloquial use of language, showing that difference in status and social class. Baby, the doctor brought for us all. So again, that verb brought being really significant, because it's suggesting that the doctor has expended the energy, that he's the one that's done all of this for us all, when I was asleep. And again, asleep there, the verb, it shows maybe the mother's role as being quite passive, which, you know, we know isn't true. She's the one that's done all of the work there in terms of pushing the baby out. But it's interesting that the effort and expenditure is it's given to the doctor, not necessarily to the mother in this instance. Okay, so I'll just go through some structural significance there, and then we'll have a little look, as I usually do, at the themes. And again, I would suggest with the themes you could potentially look at colour coding then quotes that you can find that link to each of these themes, which will be really helpful when it comes to in the exam being able to link and think about poems that link to the poem that you're given in the actual exam. In terms of structure then, so we have this regular tercet structure of stanzas that are used throughout, but it does come back then again, as I said, we've made mention there of the idea of it being circular in its approach, because it starts with the focus on the mum giving birth and the doctor arriving to assist with that, and it leaves us on that as well, so it eventually comes all the way back to it, and that there's very much the ideas of Dr. Curlin and his bag is linked almost to this idea of the Greek mythology, and mixed in with that the idea of Dr. Curlin himself being almost godlike in the ability that he has to produce this child out of his bag in Heaney's mind when he's a child. So the structure almost reflects that, and almost like the regularity of which he comes back to that idea then, and there's very much almost a kind of supernatural, spiritual aspect to medicine in Heaney's mind, or at least that's the impression that I get from the structural focus of the poem. In terms of themes then, we've got some key themes that we can explore in this one. So childhood and innocence, and we certainly get that at the start of this poem, with him believing this almost fairy tale belief, or almost Frankenstein-like idea of the doctor making babies by sort of combining body parts, Birth and creation, so again that's going to link strongly with what I've just said there as well. The idea of healing, and we talk about, we can bring in faith and spirituality to that as well when he goes to visit Epidaurus, and how he sees that as well then, which is very much contrasted with ideas that we now have about modern medicine and what we know of science. Religion, again, he mentions the ideas of Epidaurus and the gods, and Asclepius and his daughter Hygeia, and then also references Lourdes as well, which is a place of healing in the Catholic faith. Death as well here is sort of linked upon this idea of illness and death, and certainly vulnerability as well. As always then, I have got my links there, and I would encourage you to have a little look and look for more critical perspectives on each of these poems as we go through them, because obviously the more alternative interpretations you have, the wider range of ideas you've got to include when you have to write about these poems, and it will just offer you that kind of edge over others when you're sort of writing your response then, to be able to provide more than one perspective in your analysis. As ever though, any queries, any questions, any problems, please let me know either on our Google Classroom or through my email.